Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast by Bangalore International Centre.
So I noticed a tendency among these activists to focus more on the future rather than the past, to talk about the ways in which LGBT rights were important, not necessarily or not solely for moral reasons, but also because of their supposed contribution to economic growth, productivity, dynamism, basically to a better future. And that led me to thinking about how so much of queer politics is also about thinking about the future, trying to bring preferred futures into being. And so before I knew it, I realized I was writing about time. I was writing about the past and the future as it's being talked about in the present.
You just heard Rahul Rao, scholar and author of Out of Time, the Queer Politics of Postcoloniality, who in this episode of BIC Talks is in conversation with writer Kavya Murthy. Rahul and Kavya talk about the inheritance that the former colonies are living with and how they have managed to warp and expand the imperialist biases and criminalisation of the queer community. And with that, over to Kavya.
Thanks, Lekha. Hi, Rahul.
Hi, Kavya.
I am very delighted that I can speak to you about your new book, which is, for all listeners, Out of Time, the Queer Politics of Postcoloniality. And congratulations for the International Studies Association International Political Sociology Book Award, Rahul. How does it feel?
Thank you. It feels great. I was quite pleased to hear about it.
What other books do you get measured against, as it were?
Well, it's basically an award for books published in that year, so 2020, in the broad field of international political sociology.
So I thought that we could start talking about your book in terms of some key ideas that exist in it, because I feel that for people who may not end up reading it, I would like for us to be able to give them a few broad strokes for what's going on. So I thought the book predominantly, as the title says, is about time. But could you tell us a little bit about what made you think of time vis-a-vis queer politics and what brought you to it?
So I started thinking about the book in 2010, and the immediate provocation for beginning to think about these questions was a very draconian piece of legislation that had just been proposed in Uganda called the Anti-Homosexuality Bill. This was then passed into law briefly in 2014. The bill attracted attention immediately for two reasons, I think. One, because it had these incredibly draconian provisions proposing the death penalty for certain categories of offenses. And secondly, because it was passed partly at the behest of US-based Christian evangelical activists who had been engaged in global advocacy, a sort of right-wing global civil society project in which they were trying to persuade African clergy and politicians, particularly in places like Uganda, to pass these kinds of laws to, in their eyes, ward off the threat to the family posed by LGBT activists from the West. So almost immediately, this was a global story with global ramifications, even though this particular crisis was unfolding mostly in Uganda. So to study it, I had to start thinking about Uganda's history, the history of its original criminalization of homosexuality, the history of British colonialism in Uganda, because just like India, Uganda has a penal code that is partly an inheritance of British colonialism, many of whose provisions remain the same. I also had to think about the response of the international community to this crisis, so the ways in which donor states and donor institutions like the World Bank and the IMF were responding to this. Uganda is quite an aid-dependent country, so these relationships matter a lot. And of course, I was thinking simultaneously about everything that was going on in India around Section 377 and at the analogies and entanglements between these places as a result of their common inheritance from British imperialism. So to come to your question about time, one of the familiar discourses that we hear in Uganda from conservatives is this argument that homosexuality is culturally inauthentic, it's alien, it comes from outside. This is very familiar to us in India as well. So I, like many activists and academics, have been interested in how queer activists have been reaching into the past for signs of same-sex desire or evidence of same-sex desire in the pre-colonial past in order to be able to respond to this conservative challenge that there is something inauthentic about these kinds of desire. That led me to thinking about the past and memory and history. And of course, this is a very complicated set of preoccupations, but that is broadly what led me to think about the past. And then I also, while talking to Western activists, came to the realization that for many of these activists, the past is quite an embarrassing terrain for them to engage on. Because when you start talking about the past and how this sort of criminalization began, you have to have conversations about British colonialism and the way in which these kinds of homophobic laws were imposed by the colonial power in its colonies and so forth. And that makes it very complicated for them to moralize, to take the high moral ground in today's conversations about LGBT rights when they are reminded of this fact. So I noticed a tendency among these activists to focus more on the future rather than the past, to talk about the ways in which LGBT rights were important, not necessarily or not solely for moral reasons, but also because of their supposed contribution to economic growth, productivity, dynamism, basically to a better future. And that led me to thinking about how so much of queer politics is also about thinking about the future, trying to bring preferred futures into being. And so before I knew it, I realized I was writing about time. I was writing about the past and the future as it's being talked about in the present. And it became a book about time.
Speaking of time, when did you start writing the book? Which year was it, and what was happening in India then? Because things changed in the course of your writing this book in the context of Indian queerness.
I started thinking about it probably in 2008 or 9. Around this time, Queer Law Collective, actually based in Bangalore, which put together the volume Law Like Love, Arvind Narayan and Alok Gupta were quite central to that project. They had invited me to contribute a chapter to that book. And that's the first thing I wrote that had anything to do with LGBT politics. At that time, I was quite preoccupied with the aftermath of how Western LGBT activism in relation to the global South was changing or being reshaped by the preoccupations of post 9/11 global politics. I was really interested in Jaspir Puar's idea of homo-nationalism, which is a term that she uses to describe the way in which LGBT rights have become a new marker of an age-old divide between the civilized and the savage, a way of marking out particular parts of the world as modern as opposed to traditional. So that's the time in which I began. You'll know, of course, that 2009 was also the year in which the Naz Foundation judgment was delivered by the Delhi High Court. So that was a time of great excitement. Of course, that judgment has been read in different ways as more or less conservative. And then there were subsequent developments in India. In 2013, Suresh Kaushal decision from the Supreme Court, which reversed the Naz Foundation decision. And then a few months later, the Nalsa decision in 2014. So that's some of what was happening in India. But I guess it's been about 10 years in the making, and a lot has happened both in Uganda and India and in Britain, which is the other location that I'm really interested in this book.
So I found it interesting because you're talking about these three locations, which is sort of two Commonwealth nations and the erstwhile colonial state of Britain. You're also talking about a few key ideas of race and class and caste, and these things thread everything in the arguments you make through the book. Can you tell us a little bit about why you think these are the foundational categories and how they kind of interrogate who chooses to look forward, what do they look back at, and how these two relationships kind of come into play when various activist struggles have to negotiate with the state to make queer demands, as it were.
And again, it's something I came to understand myself only towards the latter stages of writing the book. So when I move from one chapter to the next, I'm shifting scenes in a sense, looking at different sets of institutions. So there are chapters that focus on the Ugandan state and its interactions with the international. There's a chapter that focuses on the way in which Britain is remembering its responsibility or culpability for exporting these laws. There's a chapter on trans struggles in India, and there's a chapter on how the international financial institutions have responded to these new human rights crises. In each of those chapters, it seemed as if I was talking about a different category. So in the chapter on Britain, I'm mostly talking about race. In the chapter on India, I'm mostly talking about caste. In the chapter on the international financial institutions, I'm mostly talking about class, even though in all these situations, the subject was ostensibly LGBT rights. So the question became, why is it that when these institutions confront the challenges, the demand for these sorts of rights, the issue becomes refracted through some other category? And the answer I come to is that these categories are so foundational to those institutions that they become the sort of master categories through which other preoccupations are refracted. Then that raises the further question of why are these categories so foundational? And here I find the work of the Black feminist theorist Hortense Spillers very powerful and useful. So her famous article, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, is subtitled An American Grammar Book. So that word grammar was very interesting to me. What does it mean for a state or a society to have a grammar? How is this grammar created? And her answer in the US context is that the grammar in which these political conflicts are waged in the United States, the grammar of race, is forged in the traumatic birth of the nation in slavery. And that those circumstances of birth are so powerful and leave such a long shadow that they set the terms in which we have conversations about everything else that follows. In the Indian context, we could say that insofar as there is a moment of birth, and it would be an interesting conversation, I think, to think about when that is and how we conceive of this idea, because of course political communities have multiple births. But if we think about the kind of revisionist histories that anti-caste radicals like Jyotirao Phule and Ambedkar have written, their account of the history of the subcontinent is very much grounded in this idea of caste conflict as being the originary schism or fault line in politics in the subcontinent. And so that seemed to me to suggest why an Indian conversation was unfolding very much along caste lines, particularly in the way that the trans movement was articulating its demands.
So I feel like this brings us to something that we were talking about earlier, which is that queer politics seem to work around two key ideas. One is of seeking recognition in terms of equality of status and visibility and identity. And the other is redistribution, in a sense of asking for clear, material, concrete welfare policies. And I found it interesting that when you were talking about the book, it seemed like the West was sort of reiterating the need for recognition as the way in which we move forward. But everywhere else, there were more concrete and clear demands. And in the Indian context, that there seemed to be two things going on. One was the general decriminalization process, and the other was what was happening around NALSA, which was trans rights. And over here, I thought it would be interesting if you spoke a little bit about viewing this entire thing through Ambedkar and the backward classes and their demands. So what you call in your book backward futures, because I felt like that was most relevant to the post-colonial struggle of queerness. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
So this recognition redistribution fault line, I would not map it so neatly onto geography. I think actually everywhere these struggles are divided on these priorities. So even in the West, I would say, and by West I mean the UK and the US, the sort of North Atlantic, there is a divide between a politics focused primarily on recognition, reflected in preoccupations like the desire for same-sex marriage or the right to serve in the military and these kinds of priorities, and politics of redistribution, which is about the ownership of material things, who has resources, who has access to housing and welfare and healthcare. And I think queer movements are divided in terms of which of these things they prioritize. Of course, many people want both, but there are always questions to be asked about what comes first, I think. And I think we see a similar divide in the Indian context as well, as you alluded in your question, where some fractions of the queer movement have been very focused on equality of status. And this is symbolized by the demand for same-sex marriage, for example, which we've begun to hear about more in the aftermath of the reading down of Section 377. But I think the trans movement in India, even before and alongside the struggle against 377, has been talking about material welfare for a long time. So even before the Nalsa judgment, if we think about trans activism in places like Tamil Nadu, the demand was for trans communities to be recognized as a backward class and to be given access to the same kinds of material welfare and reservation that other backward class communities had. Now that analogy for me is really interesting. And in chapter 6 of the book, I talk about how this is both an analogy, but it is also something more. The phrase backward futures is something I take from Lucinda Ramberg's work. She argues that when she's studying Dalit politics in South India, she's thinking very carefully about the kinds of futures that these politics anticipate and hope to struggle towards. And she uses the term backward futures to capture those interests and preoccupations. So I've asked in following on from her, what it means for the trans community to contemplate backward futures. What is the purpose of trying to analogize oneself to a backward class community? And I suggest in the chapter that this is about more than simply making an analogy for pragmatic purposes to access the same welfare and reservations and so forth. In some trans narratives, I also think it is about entering into an Ambedkarite politics of annihilating caste. And so I'm particularly interested in trans narratives and autobiographies that speak very explicitly about how gender transition also destroys caste respectability, which is embraced as a part of the liberation that these activists are working towards.
It's interesting to me, again, this seems like it may not be so precisely located in the West, and I'm not making those geographical differences, but the notion of what we're moving towards is one seems to be a conversation of assimilating into broader society and so on, but also in order to reach there are certain demands you have to make in terms of your where you come from, and talking about what you call various categories that inform it. So what parallels would you draw between the Ugandan and Indian activist struggles? What would you find in common, given that they had the same sort of, they inherited the similar law that they both countries chose to maintain even after independence? What similarities do you see between the two places?
That's a difficult question for me to answer because I didn't really in the book engage in a kind of side-by-side comparison. I wanted to engage with these struggles on their own terms in terms of what their preoccupations and priorities were. But there are similarities, as you suggest, and some of those similarities come out of the thing that they're both fighting against, which is a provision in a penal code that is in some sense inherited from a colonial past. Inherited, but not fully inherited, because one of the arguments I make in the book is that the colonial past explains the origin of the law. It doesn't explain why it has persisted. To think about that, we have to think about how post-colonial regimes have embraced these laws, given them new meaning, resignified them, and made them their own. And here, perhaps we could draw comparisons, although I don't do this in the book so much, but we could draw comparisons between the way in which, for example, Christian evangelical fundamentalism in Uganda has taken up these laws as a way of protecting what they call traditional family values. See, that itself is an imported term. It's a term that American conservatives used quite a lot. And it seems to have been directly taken up by Ugandan conservatives. But certainly there are parallels to be drawn, I think, between Christian fundamentalism in Uganda and Hindu fundamentalism in India, of the kind that the Shiv Sena was very central to promulgating at the time of the controversy over fire, for example. So this is a moment where religious fundamentalists take up a colonial provision and give it new meaning for their own purposes, right? So there's that commonality. And I think that means that activist strategies also have something in common. This desire to counter that conservative queerphobic discourse by reaching into the pre-colonial past for evidence of same-sex desire. We see this in the Indian context with work like Ruth Vanitha and Salim Kidwai's, and the kind of arguments that were made in court on the basis of that sort of work. In the Ugandan context, I was curious to see whether there would be a similar reaching into the pre-colonial past. So I became very interested in the story of the last pre-colonial ruler of the Kingdom of Buganda, which is the largest of the pre-colonial kingdoms that were merged to form present-day Uganda. This is a figure who is supposed to have had sex with men in his court until the Christian missionaries arrive, convert them to Christianity, teach them that this is a sin, at which point they refuse the king his sexual demands, and he's very angry, puts them to death in a public execution in 1886. And then the Catholic Church wages a campaign to have them canonized as the first martyrs of Christianity in that part of the world. So this is a very well-known story in Uganda. Unlike some of the same-sex histories in South Asia, which have had to be excavated, where we've had to do work to remind people, this is a story in Uganda that anyone who has had contact with the church is aware of or has some version of. So I was interested in whether and how and to what extent Ugandans were reaching into their pre-colonial past as a way to respond to these fundamentalist queerphobic claims. So at that level, again, I think there are some similar preoccupations and dynamics at work.
This brings me to an interesting part of your book, which I think draws from other work that you do on reparations and statues and how, in general, states need to look back to their, sort of colonial histories, in which you talked about how Britain is willing to sort of apologize publicly for having imposed the penal code, which is it still persists across, I think, 42 nations of the Commonwealth, but refuses to sort of publicly apologize for slavery. So for me, this sort of it's like a thread that you weave through your book about redistribution and recognition, right? So could you tell us a little bit about those debates? Because it was quite fascinating how time is looked at. How far back do you need to apologize for is also another thing you examine in all of your other work. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, thank you. So in Britain, as a result of Global South activists forcefully reminding conservatives in their home countries, as well as the global audience more generally, that these laws originally came from British colonial penal codes, there is a relatively new awareness among British LGBT circles that they have something to answer for, that Britain has a kind of culpability in the struggles that are unfolding in Commonwealth countries against these laws. So you've begun to see a discourse of apology, I would say almost atonement, for these kinds of laws. In 2012, the House of Lords was the site for a debate on the treatment of homosexual men and women in the developing world. This is what the debate was titled. And it was interesting to see white conservative members of the House of Lords standing up one after the other to say, these laws are a toxic legacy of colonialism. We should be ashamed. We have a responsibility that flows from this, etc., etc. It's very rare to encounter elite conservatives in Britain willing to reckon with the negative side of colonialism on any issue. So I became curious about how is it that this issue has produced apologies for colonialism in a way that no other issue has. So I then juxtaposed these parliamentary debates with other debates that happened in 2007 on the bicentenary of the abolition of slavery. These were much larger, more complicated debates. They took place all over the world. And in Britain, they took place in parliament, in schools and civil society spaces, in community organizations. So it's difficult to compare these two debates, but I try and do this nonetheless. And what you see in these debates, particularly among political elites, is an unwillingness to apologize, the making of a number of different excuses. Suddenly the issue becomes much more complicated. It's not simple to apologize, and the responsibilities that follow from perpetuating slavery for this long period are somehow much more difficult to grapple with. So then I ask a series of questions. Why is it possible to apologize for the sexual and particularly the homosexual legacies of colonialism, but not so much for the racial legacies of colonialism? And I recognize that this is a kind of artificial split, but that artificial split is made in this discourse. So I kind of run with it for part of that chapter. And I consider three possible reasons. One is the claim that slavery happened too long ago to apologize for. So again, this is about time. And I try and take that question on by using the work of Saidiya Hartman, who's written very powerfully in the US context about the afterlives of slavery. Her argument broadly is that we cannot date these things. We cannot assume that on the date of emancipation, slavery as an institution was simply lifted and people were free. In fact, economic conditions don't change very much for the formerly emancipated enslaved people all over the world. And more fundamentally, the life prospects of people don't expand very much. In fact, she would argue, I think, that African Americans continue to live in the afterlife of slavery. And we can talk about also, I think, the afterlives of indentured labor and the legacies of slavery and racism that this leaves behind in Britain as well as in other parts of the world. So the time issue is not as clear-cut as conservatives would claim. Slavery long ago, homosexual laws just a few decades ago. Then I consider the issue of money. And here, of course, the concern among conservatives is that if you apologize for slavery, you will have to pay out a huge amount in reparations. And yes, there has been a demand for reparations, including monetary reparations, particularly from Caribbean states. And yes, those sums of money would be enormous.
Could you mention the sum of money? Because I thought it was outstanding and staggering.
I'll have to look it up.
72 trillion?
I think somebody did a calculation. I think it was Robert Beckford and a team of people he worked with did a calculation at a few years ago, and they came up with a figure which was absolutely staggering. And I think they did it not so much in the expectation that this monetary reparation would in fact happen, but just to emphasize the sheer scale of the responsibility. But other reparations activists have said that this is not primarily about money, because no amount of money could ever compensate for the enormity of this kind of responsibility. And so they've been arguing that rather than reducing the reparations question to money, we should think about all sorts of other ways in which the global North can pay reparations to the global South. We could think, for example, about debt and whether we should even conceive of North-South relations in terms of the South being indebted to the North. Perhaps we should reframe development aid not as a charity or benevolence, but as a duty, an obligation that follows from these histories. So in all these ways, we could reconceptualize North-South relations around a range of issues, including, say, things like climate justice, in ways that take into account these terrible histories and that atone for them. So the third difference between these two contexts, I think, is race. And this ends up being the central argument of the chapter, which is that when British elites look at laws criminalizing homosexuality, I think they tend to see primarily the white figures who suffered as a result of these laws. Figures like Alan Turing, Oscar Wilde, think of the figures who loom larger than life in Western LGBT imaginaries. We might add people like Jean Genet and Harvey Milk to that pantheon. So queerness becomes equated with whiteness, or it becomes possible to imagine the queer victim of these laws as white. And I think that plays a very powerful role in making it easier or more contemplable or more palatable for British elites to apologize for those laws than for the slavery laws, where, as we know, obviously most of the people who were enslaved were racialized as non-white and particularly as Black. And that has, I think, very different effect, particularly in contemporary British politics, where the British state today is not even willing to acknowledge that structural racism is a reality in contemporary British politics. So it leads to a very different attitude towards reckoning with the racial legacies of the past.
But I just found the number that Robert Beckford counted, and it's not 72 trillion, but 7.5 trillion Great British pounds. So that is quite a staggering sum. But what's interesting to me, Rahul, while you think about this, is that you brought up the word development. And I was struck by the way in which you talk about global finance and development as things that also now begin to kind of come together with queer rights, and going back to what you called homo nationalism, this idea that it's a kind of barometer for how well states are doing. And this very silly thing that actually seems to have happened, where the British wish to apologize for it, but then they place sanctions on countries that are seen as homophobic, and the kind of new imperialism that sort of creates again, and how blind they are to that. So I found that very, very interesting, because one could argue that in the Indian context, there are a lot of sort of homo nationalist, or what you call homo capitalist demands. it's the way to be modern, it's the way to move into the future. Could you unpack that a little bit?
In the run-up to one of the Commonwealth heads of government meetings, LGBT activists in Britain, like Peter Tatchell, were talking about how Britain needed to apologize for homophobic laws. And David Cameron, who was then the British Prime Minister, in an interview, very quickly reframed this demand for apology into a position where Britain would now make aid to recipient countries contingent on respect for LGBT rights. So the demand for apology on the part of Britain was quickly transformed into a new form of conditionality in which Britain would exercise power once again. And that was interesting to me, how states, in the attempt to avoid expressing shame, are very quick to try and seize some ability to exercise power. This is not dissimilar from the way in which, when Britain is asked to apologize for slavery, it very quickly says, but we were at the forefront of abolition, and references people like William Wilberforce and the kind of abolitionist campaign that he's credited with leading. So I think it's a way to avoid expressing shame by looking for ways to express pride in moral and political leadership. It's a way of avoiding saying sorry in a way that is meaningful, I think.
I thought this was an interesting category that we could discuss, which is the costless recognition politics versus costly redistribution politics. And if you could dwell on that, especially in terms of the post-colonial context that you're speaking about, where what is the difference in making a demand for identity and recognition and visibility? And this is a conversation that's been coming up in the last week around the Trans Day of Visibility also, which is what are the costs of visibility, but what are the things that you really need? So could you talk about that?
Yeah, I think when states are confronted with demands from social movements, there is a tendency to accept those demands that can be met quite easily without much change. And very often the demand for recognition, please recognize that I am equal, is easier for states to accede to because it doesn't always require a material redistribution of resources. It doesn't always require the state to spend money to create new institutions and so on and so forth. So states are often quite willing to accept recognition demands, but much more unwilling to redistribute resources. And this has to do, I think, with the fact that the state is also embedded in a capitalist economy, where resources move in accordance with certain logics. And the state is also beholden to those rules and has to play by those rules in the world economy in which we live today. So very often redistributionist demands are also anti-capitalist demands, or at least demands that put the capitalist system under pressure. And I think maybe this alerts us to the ways in which, in some ways, capitalism is harder to fight against than states that have their vulnerabilities and can be pushed and prodded in different ways if one accumulates sufficient social force against them. And that's what makes me think about homo capitalism as something that we have to confront and deal with. This is a term that I use to describe a counterpart to Puar's homo nationalism, where some elite LGBT activists, I think, believe that a better way to persuade states to change their attitudes towards LGBT and sexual and gender minorities is to convince those states that these groups stand to contribute to the economy if only they are liberated from their circumstances of criminalization and so forth. This is a way of telling the state, look, we are model capitalist subjects in waiting, and if only we were free and healthy, we would be able to contribute to the growth and the dynamism that you wish for the society. And what it does, I think, is it draws queer movements away from other kinds of social movements that have been talking about the problems that capitalism creates, whether it's accumulation of resources, displacement, labor conditions. It separates queer movements away from left movements in this other sense. And it's a kind of strategy of divide and rule. I think it suits elites to separate demands for recognition from demands for redistribution, to satisfy the demand for recognition and say, okay, now you've got what you want, please demobilize. There is no need to be a social movement anymore.
And I think to bring this up in the context of how the trans movement's demand for backward class status is a way of talking in general about larger social hierarchies and talking alongside people who also need to be brought up the social ladder and to break that system down. So, could you talk a little bit about Ambedkarite ideas and sensibilities that do inform the movement over here? Because you do dwell on that towards the end of your book quite a lot.
So the last two chapters of the book you could read as two contrasting strategies for queer advancement and emancipation. The first is the kind of homo capitalist strategy where queer activists aspire to upward mobility. They aspire to join the ranks of the new middle class and to convince the state that their liberation would help them contribute to this growth project of a rising India and so on. The second strategy, which is what he has pursued, particularly in the Nalsa judgment and after, is a strategy of making common cause with those at the bottom of the social ladder, with a view to demolishing that ladder, right? Which is what Ambedkar's annihilation of caste is about. Ambedkar is very interesting to me as a queer theorist because I think his strategies of emancipation point the way forward through many dilemmas that we confront today. So his project for Dalits is radically anti-assimilationist. He doesn't want Dalits to become like caste Hindus. He doesn't want them to assimilate and dissolve into some kind of casteless society. Instead, he believes that Hinduism is so irredeemable that he needs to step outside of it. And so famously, he converts to Buddhism towards the end of his life. And leads his followers out of caste Hinduism into this neo-Buddhism that he refashions. But at the same time, he's not a separatist. So as the first law minister of independent India, despite not being a Hindu himself, he's deeply invested in the reform of Hindu law, which is why we see legislative interventions in Hindu law and reform. Of course, it happens too slowly for him, and he ultimately resigns from Nehru's cabinet because of the slowness of the project and the objections and hurdles that are placed in his way. But it is nonetheless something that he's invested in. So he's both anti-assimilationist and not separatist. And I think that is a very interesting position for queer activists to contemplate. A strategy that does not require becoming the same as heteronormative society, but also doesn't set up a kind of separatist enclave, because we need to think, I think, about whether such separatist sensibilities and projects are sustainable or whether they simply get sucked back into mainstream and hegemonic society. So I think the Ambedkarite project is very interesting to me because of the way in which it refuses both of these possibilities.
This for me is about two questions that, in setting up the chronology of various things, you talk about how sometimes the movement for queer rights is viewed as first basic rights, then sex rights, then love rights. And along these three kinds of rights, you also have the question of the post-colonial queer questions, which are what you working yourself out of, and the question that Puar asks, which is what happens now that we've got what we want. And what I found interesting about your work is that it doesn't seem to need to claim one or the other is better. And you point to how various questions can be both radical and conservative at the same time. So could you unpack that a little bit, this sort of chronology that exists along these things?
Yeah. So this chronology of basic rights, sex rights, love rights is a kind of conservative trajectory that mainstream Western activists seem to think is the path that one has to follow. And it's been taken up, I think, in other places as well. The assumption being that you need to first decriminalize, people first need to be free from prison sentences and torture and so forth. And then you can talk about welfareist demands. Now, this is not always how things have panned out in other parts of the world. So it's been very interesting for me to see how in Uganda, even though homosexuality remains criminalized, queer activists have been able to go to court for other kinds of reliefs, whether it's relief against the police raiding houses on spurious grounds or the tabloid press outing activists and inciting violence against them. And the judiciary has shown a willingness to rule in favor of the queer applicants without decriminalization happening. Now, that's not to say decriminalization is not important. Of course it is. But it does show us, I think, that there is no necessary path or trajectory that everybody has to follow in order to get to the more emancipatory futures that they hope for. And that's been quite salutary for me to see and to think about. And I suppose this is a way of also criticizing these linear ideas of time and progress and development that we are constantly encouraged to follow and play by.
So I thought right now it would be interesting for you to talk to us about various queer theorists that you mention in your work, because I found it quite illuminating the way in which you use various texts to unpack ideas. Could you talk about 4 or 5 major sources that you've used? Because I feel like I'd like to explore them further, because in a sense, your book is about queer struggles in the global south and how they negotiate the past and future. So around that idea.
As I mentioned earlier, Jaspir Puar's work on homo nationalism was really important to me, and it gave me a language in which to think about the problems with hegemonic queer strategies of emancipation. And I suppose I've tried to complement her ideas with this notion of homo capitalism, to think about how LGBT activists also use capitalism and the desire to enter into capitalism as a vehicle for emancipation. So she's a central reference point in the work. 3 Ugandan scholars have been very important to my work. Sylvia Tamale, who's the former dean of the law faculty in Makerere University in Kampala. She was one of the first people who I came across who said that in protesting and pushing back against this conservative claim that homosexuality is imported, activists have, of course, brought up the issue of the anti-homosexuality law being brought in by outsiders. So they've said, it's not homosexuality that's imported, it's the homophobia that's imported. And she was one of the first people who said, look, that's true, but this is not fully convincing, because we need to take responsibility for our own agency in producing these kinds of laws. And her writing gave me, an outsider, I read it as a kind of permission to start thinking about Ugandan agency in this crisis and to write about the very problematic politics of clergy and politicians in Uganda who had helped bring this law into being and had been some of its driving agents. A second person was Sylvia Nanyonga Tamusuza, who's an ethnomusicologist. And she has done some really interesting work on pre-colonial gender ideas in Buganda. And this work is interesting because it shows us how 19th century Buganda and the time of the king Mwanga, who I write about, understood gender very differently from the way that the colonial missionaries who arrived did, or indeed the way that present-day Ugandans might do. This is a world in which gender is not just about anatomy, it's also about your status, whether you are a royal or a commoner. So all royals are gendered male, regardless of anatomy. All commoners are gendered female. It depends on whether you're inside the palace or outside the palace. And it, I suppose, helped me understand how 19th century Baganda might have viewed the corporeal desires and intimacies of their king very differently from how present-day Ugandans, or indeed any of us outside, might look at this. And the other Ugandan scholar who really shaped the book in ways that are too numerous to really pin down is Stella Nyanzi, who is one of the preeminent queer theorists, I'd say, anywhere today, one of the most important ethnographers and anthropologists of the movement, fearless dissident in Ugandan politics today, and one of President Museveni's most prominent opponents. She's currently living in exile in Kenya. She's a really shining example for me of what a queer theorist can be and do well beyond the confines of the academy. And I think she's an inspiration to many people for these reasons. And in the Indian context, I think the person who influenced me the most, although I don't use their work as much as I probably should have in the book, is Akshay Khanna, whose book, Sexualness, which, is very interesting because of the way in which it forces us to think about sexual politics outside of the idiom of sexuality. That is, how do we think about desire without necessarily connecting it to identity or a politician? And that, to me, is a really profound idea and work. I haven't used it as much in this book, I think, because I was mostly working with activists who do work in an idiom of sexuality, perhaps because they are too attached to an international system from which they seek resources and ideas and solidarity, which is structured in accordance with ideas of sexuality. And so there is a kind of hegemony to that idea, which is very hard to shake off.
So, Rahul, now that we've discussed your book, I think, quite well, what are you working on next? And what are the ways in which you hope to bring some of these, do you hope to bring some of these ideas into activism so that people can think through the various formulations and demands that are made?
Yeah, I'm still interested in the politics of time, and I've become interested in the way in which this is manifesting itself in controversies around statues. I've actually recorded a podcast for BIC before on this. I'm interested both in statues coming down in many parts of the West, particularly as a result of the demands of movements like Black Lives Matter. And I'm also interested in statues coming up in places like India on ever larger scales. I think these are all different terrains on which struggles around race and caste are playing themselves out. They are also about the politics of time, because we're both confronting history, but also trying to project and build certain kinds of futures that are symbolized by these artifacts. So there are continuities, I think, between this book and the work that I'm currently doing, but it's taking me to new places, and it's forcing me, I think, to centralize race and caste much more than I have in my work before.
Are there any new interesting statues in India that you'd like us all to think about?
Probably all the ones that people are already aware of. I'm interested in the Statue of Unity, for example. And every month one seems to read accounts of new proposals for even bigger statues, whether it's of Shivaji currently under construction in Bombay, but also Ram in Ayodhya. And there are projects for statues of Birsa Munda in Chhattisgarh and other parts of the country. And I think there are all of these proliferating terrains on which statue building seems to have become a major preoccupation.
Thank you, Rahul, for talking about your book.
Thanks, Kavya. It's been a really great conversation.
Thank you for hanging in there and listening to the full conversation. If you liked what you heard, do share it with friends and family. You can also leave us a review or rating on iTunes and Apple Podcasts. The crew behind this podcast is Gaurav Krishna on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Sarvanaraj and Raghu Tenkaila. Episode artwork and design is by Chandni Venkataraman. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org. This is Lekha Naidu, signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.